Thank you all, and it's certainly humbling to speak in front of such a distinguished crowd. I remember when I was in high school at Baton Rouge High, that I would often come through. I think Interact was the local club there, and would often come and really be in awe of all the speakers, and said, "Look, it's my bucket list one day to come and speak." And now, 20 plus years later, I am here. So greatly appreciate the opportunity. The second is, and I don't want to belabor to folks that are here and the folks that are listening, sometimes we could take for granted these kinds of events and the importance and impact that connecting with each other and what comes out of these meetings after hearing from a speaker, we take those things for granted. And I'll give you a perfect example of the power of Rotary and the power of this club. It was February of last year that the folks from Auctioner invited Mayor Broome and I to come and serve as Warner Thomas's guest. In fact, it was one of the last meetings that y'all had, I think mid-February, right before the pandemic started. And so Mayor Broome and I were sitting at the very front of the table, and Warner was talking about his vision of really addressing the challenges that folks throughout the state had in accessing basic primary care. And I said, well, wow, I mean, that's a challenge in North Baton Rouge. It's always been an issue in places that are whose majority household income is significantly less than in the urban areas. And I said, Mayor, I think we need to make a play and be as aggressive as we can with Warner to convince them to invest in North Baton Rouge. Several months later, we got him to do that. And it was through this meeting, February of last year, that we were able to get him to invest in North Baton Rouge. And I think they're expected to see 10,000 patients in North Baton Rouge. So really hats off, tip of the hat to all of you guys for the impact that Rotary has. I want to also highlight a special mic. So the guest that I brought over today, Representative Daryl Desautels from Avoyelles. Representative Desautels has really been instrumental in driving all things broadband throughout the state. He's one of the few legislators, I would imagine, that has decades and decades of deep expertise on an issue which I think is going to be, which I believe is going to be critical towards our competitiveness as a state for years and decades to come. So thank you, Representative Desautels, for coming. And then David Aubrey, who's a senior executive at AT&T. I'm sure you know all of him, and he knows all of you. But he plays a critical role in really ensuring the success, along with our colleagues from Cox and with all of you guys, in ensuring that the folks here in Baton Rouge, but also throughout the state, are successful in getting the kind of broadband speeds that we clearly need. So thank you, David. Thank you, Anthony and Aaron, for all of your efforts. So with that, I wanted to spend a few minutes on how we're framing the challenges that we have with regards to broadband in the state. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, this whole broadband thing wasn't an idea that we had suddenly coming out of the pandemic. In fact, it was Governor Edwards in late fall of 2019 through an executive order where he created the Broadband for Everyone Louisiana Commission. And so that was months and months and months before everything shifted to home when it comes to our ability to live and our ability to function. At the same time, Representative Desautels clearly recognized at the session last year that our ability to be competitive and our ability to be successful in life in Louisiana would be throttled if we didn't have a purposeful broadband office. So through his legislation that he drafted with Senator Beth Mizell out of Washington Parish, they came together, created the legislation to create the Office of Broadband and Connectivity, and the governor signed it. And so our office functionally sits within the Division of Administration. Our office started March 29th of this year, and I report to Jay Darden in this job. So, so just a couple of things as we start to frame out really what the three biggest issues we have in the state of Louisiana. So we asked McKinsey and Company to do some, using secondary analysis and secondary research, to do some top-down analysis on how many households in the state of Louisiana lack basic broadband. how many of those folks can't afford it, and how many folks throughout the rest of the state lack the digital literacy required to understand how to utilize it if you give it to them. And so what we realized, and through their secondary research, which they leveraged the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, Census Bureau, American Community Surveys, is that we have almost 500,000 households in the state of Louisiana, representing almost 1.2, 1.3 million Louisianians that do not have adequate broadband speeds. So we're talking about 25 to 30% of the state's population. It is sizable. It's sizable. 43.6% of those folks can't afford it. Now, the affordability issue largely speaks to structural issues we've had in the state, where you have certain parishes, let's say East Carroll Parish in the very northeastern part of the state, whose average median household income is $16,000, $17,000 a year. I mean, structurally, they can't afford it because it's often the first thing that's eliminated within their household budget, even if they have access to it. And then you have 744,000 adults in Louisiana that lack the digital literacy skills. Now, those are not adults that have school-age kids that, in essence, serve as their geek squad. So, you know, my parents live in Miami. They call me every other day and said, help me do this, this, this. So, in essence, the folks that have school-age kids are blessed and fortunate to serve as their little geek squad. But for vast majority of adults, that is a problem. And it is especially a problem and was clearly evident in the parishes when suddenly you told folks to basically use the internet to go see their primary care doctor, or to go pay their bills, or to watch a movie, or to do something that required adequate broadband speeds. So those are the three challenges that we have: access, affordability, and literacy. Now, what I want to share, though, is on the flip side, and the good news is that really thanks to, you know, the Coxes of the world, the AT&Ts, the CenturyLinks, now Lumens, really the private sector, when you start to look at the foundation and base that's going to allow us to eliminate that digital divide by 2029, it's largely because of the private sector that have made substantial investments in fiber, right? So in this stuff. And I wanted to bring this stuff because people think, oh, fiber, what is it? This is all it is. It's conduit. And this fiber, which is really the length of hair, our hair, is what drives the digital economy. So this is all it is. That's fundamentally at the end of the day. And our goal by 2029, with the financial resources we have that we're going to get from the federal government, is to put this and to connect this ideally in every household that's unserved in the state of Louisiana. And so we ranked number 18 according to US News in terms of gigabit infrastructure. So we're not last. Infrastructure rankings by US News uses broadband as 1/3 of their rankings and 1/3 of their weight. So we rank 18. And we rank 33 if you start to combine other things like wired low price plans, speeds, and access. So again, not catastrophic, not the best, but it's actually a fundamentally great start for us to build our efforts on. So the vision, 2029, our goal is that most, if not all, of the households will have high-speed broadband, whether it's fiber, and again, it's a function of financial resources, or satellite. Now, for us in Baton Rouge, I think we take for granted our options. You know, we've got a multitude of options. But for a lot of the parishes that are in the rural areas, satellite's their only bet. And I have spent, and it's been great, the last 3 months that I've been on this job, I have been to a lot of small towns. There are 355 towns in Louisiana that have below 6,000 people. So really small areas. And for a lot of these guys, whether it's where I'm going tonight, which is Patterson, Louisiana, yesterday it was in Bruley and Addis, last week it was in Logansport and Stonewall, satellite's the only option for some of these folks. And satellite is not the best and reliable. And so given the efforts that we've been able to piece together over the last couple of months and what's coming, I think we could significantly address some of their broadband issues for folks that live in the parishes and rural areas. For every dollar invested in broadband, it's a 4 times multiplier in terms of economic impact. And so at 11 o'clock this morning, the world's best kept secret was finally revealed, and Amazon is, I can now say Amazon, and we can all say Amazon in Cortana. What's really interesting about Amazon is that they are heavily investing in addressing the broadband challenge as well. They are investing $10 billion to put up a lot of satellites in the air, and they want to reach customers that they feel they are not reaching. Why? Because those folks can't hit the submit button. Basic. And so why it's important for them, why it's important for all of us that we really push broadband, it's because fundamentally it's the number 1, number 2, and number 3 economic development challenge in the parishes. Second bullet point I wanted to focus on our efforts. There's a lot of money focused on broadband. There's just a lot of money coming from all sorts of different places from the federal government. The state of Louisiana, through the American Rescue Plan that President Biden signed in March, the state's getting $3 billion. The parishes, towns, villages, every nook and cranny is getting $1.6 billion. They can use that money for water or sewer or broadband, and within broadband, they could use it for infrastructure, addressing affordability and addressing literacy. In addition to that, we've got our state broadband grant program. In addition to that, you've got 26 other federal programs focused on broadband, whether it's for the farmers, whether it's to address rural health care, whether it's to address issues around literacy or affordability. You name it, there's a federal program. Then the last bullet point is, if we were to assume in the Biden infrastructure bill, which he has currently $100 billion for broadband, if you were to assume the Republican counter, which is $65 billion, regardless if it's $100 billion or $65 billion, Louisiana stands to get an additional $1.2 billion over 8 years to addressing broadband. So that's why I feel bullish that we can solve this problem, because I think for the first time, we've got the financial resources, but I think more importantly, there's absolute alignment between the state, the legislature, every parish community leader, every nonprofit leader, every school board leader, you name it, there's complete and total alignment, whether you live in urban or rural areas, that broadband is something we need to solve, and we need to solve quickly. So very tactically, and I'm going to just highlight some of the key solutions that are right in front of us. Late last year, the Federal Communications Commission, through a reverse auction, is awarded 13 companies in Louisiana $342 million to provide high-speed broadband to 175,000 households throughout the rest of the state. So currently, where are we today with those 13 companies and their plans? They're currently getting their technical forms or their business plans being evaluated by the FCC. We're hopeful by the end of this year, those will get approved. Construction begins next year. They have a 6-year obligation to build the entirety of that network. The second quiver in the arrow is the bill that Representative Desitel authored, which is to create a state broadband grant program for the first time in history. And so we went from 0 financial resources at the state level on broadband now to potentially $180 million, that our office currently is drafting the rules and drafting the guidelines and criteria to push out in September of this year. And so that's our goal. September of this year, push that broadband grant program out and hopefully get the results by the end of the year, so that construction phase starts to begin. If you were to combine that FCC program late last year with the $180 million from House bill, if executed in the way we are thinking about execution, we're talking about $560 million over the next 5-6 years. That's going to be invested in broadband and addressing that access issue. So we're talking about 300,000 households that we think we can conservatively help, which means solving 65% of the access problem. Okay. Second, and this is the map that the FCC provided. I know it's not clear, and I could certainly share it with all of you. This is the map of Louisiana that shows the 13 companies that are going to provide high-speed broadband. So whether it's fiber to the home or some other method to these areas throughout the state. So the areas in blue, the areas in green have committed to the FCC that they will build fiber to each and every one of those homes. And those two companies that have the areas in blue and green have already, they have about 100 out of the 175,000 households. And they've got a 6-year commitment. SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company, has a subsidiary called Starlink. And Starlink is, I think, the 3rd largest group that has the most number of households that they're going to cover. And they've got areas in the very southern part of the state, the middle part of the state, northwest and northeastern part of the state. So we're actively talking to Starlink about how we can make their products affordable for those 30,000 folks. So this gives you a really good idea of the geographical spread that these 175,000 households make up that's going to help address the broadband issue. Affordability. So we talked about access. Next is affordability. 43.6% of the folks can't afford it. There is a lot of financial resources federally being driven to help us address the affordability piece. On May 12th, the FCC launched something called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which is really focused on those folks that have either experienced a catastrophic loss of income due to the pandemic, or that's on SNAP, that's on free and reduced lunch, and that sits significantly below the poverty line. And so I'm happy to share that since May 12th, we have had 81,401 Louisianians that have gotten temporary relief on their broadband bills. That actually puts us at the top 5 in the country. And so that's really a function of pushing and driving out the importance of affordability and for that aligned message to occur across the state in terms of making sure that people are well aware that there are programs focused on this benefit program. The state of North Carolina and the governor's staff in North Carolina reached out to us last week, and they're quite intrigued why we have our numbers so high. And so we're often sharing information through the National Governors Association and through the feds, what we're doing in terms of best practices with other states. I will say we're a little bit ahead of Texas for the first time. I know I had to say that on broadband. So that's where we are on the affordability piece. On July 1st, the FCC is going to launch something called the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which is really a measure to help and another benefit program to help folks afford devices, right? So computers, Chromebooks, et cetera. And so we're working on a partnership at Starlink there, which is Elon Musk's company, to see if we can use some of that emergency connectivity funds to help pay for that set-top boxes and those kits and for 1 year of service. The last is on the literacy piece. And this is where it gets really interesting, namely because most of the federal funds are focused less on literacy, which then compels our office to come up with some really unique public-private partnerships. And I'll tell you, this is probably the most difficult aspect to crack, namely because we have to understand on a parish-by-parish perspective how many of the folks that are between 16 and 65 years old lack the basic digital literacy skills that are required to best utilize broadband. I mentioned earlier 355 towns below 6,000 people. Typically in every small town, you're going to find what? You're going to find a library. You're going to find maybe a primary care clinic. You're going to find an LSU Ag Extension office. You're going to find a high school. You're going to find a community college. So Monty Sullivan, LCTCS is in 57 out of 64 parishes. Trusted local anchors. What else do you think you guys can find in a small town that's below 6,000 people? Church?
Dollar store.
Dollar store. Dollar General. Yeah. In every small town, if you start to pay attention to the dollar stores and Dollar Generals, they've got one big problem. pay attention to what sits on top of their roofs. They've got a little satellite dish. Their satellite dish, the purpose of that is to help their customers and their employees ring the purchases through their POS systems. If they don't have that, they have a broadband problem. So Dollar General, which is a Fortune 90 company, a $50 billion company that's building 1,000 stores every year, has a broadband problem fundamentally that they're trying to address. The second is they have done some analysis in Louisiana, and there are 163 Dollar Generals that sit in what is called a digital desert. So there's no broadband, and there's no mechanism for people to access broadband. The other thing that they have that they want to work on with us is digital literacy. Because I think you could start to create behavior change among folks that live in the rural areas, wherein we could train folks on basic literacy skills. Maybe you get trained at the LSU Ag office. The instruction is beamed in by someone from LCTCS that lives in Bossier or Shreveport. And for folks that get that certificate, they redeem that at a Dollar General. And so I think if we start to create those interesting public-private partnerships, that's going to dangle the carrot to really compel adults in a lot of these markets, then I think we can make a big difference. In fact, pending the weather, we have executives from Dollar General flying in from Tennessee tomorrow to meet with our office to talk about this. And so they are keen on working with us. So that's something that we're really looking at is in a lot of these small towns, rather than recreating the wheel, let's really take advantage of the assets that exist. Water towers, anything that's government owned, right? Let's look at the church, the school, and you could effectively piece together a really interesting broadband plan taking advantage of all those assets to help address access, affordability, and literacy. Okay. So the last slide that I wanted to share is where we are as an office. So we're moving as quickly as possible. The challenge with our office, which I enjoy, and I'm having a lot of fun with this, is the fact that it's not like I'm sliding into someone else's role. So there isn't a whole lot of precedent. So we have to create the office from scratch, create the vision, the mission. You have to hire folks. So I'm going to be fully staffed up, which is really 2 more people by Tuesday. And I have a governor's fellow that's assigned to us over the next 9 weeks. So we're going to have 3 FTEs, full-time employees, including myself, plus 2. One is going to focus really on the rules and the creation of the rules and the administration of the grants. The other is a policy analyst to understand and help us develop these really innovative public-private partnerships. But we'll be fully staffed by Tuesday, which is going to be a really big help. The second is there is a huge knowledge gap that exists, especially when we travel throughout the state, in terms of people's awareness of what is and isn't broadband and why is it important. So when people think of broadband, they think maybe only fiber, but there are other options. When people think of broadband, they think of only satellite, but there are other options. So we're creating a broadband toolkit to help parish leaders, to help folks understand how to start, where to start, and who they need to start to put together as a sort of a broadband team specific to their parish. The challenge is it is really difficult to create a one-size-fits-all broadband plan for the state because what works in St. Tammany is going to be far different than what works in Avoyelles. It's going to be far different than what works in urban parts of Jefferson Parish and in Grand Isle. So similar to healthcare where everything is local, it's broadband. So there's going to be different approaches to solving this problem in a lot of these parishes. The second is, third bullet point is data gathering. So we're continuing to ingest as much data as possible. We're meeting next week with Secretary Phillips of LDH to understand, for instance, where those folks are that are on Medicaid throughout the state that are having issues with regards to affordability that we can maybe layer on and help create some really interesting programs for folks that are on Medicaid. Because if they're on Medicaid, they may not be able to afford the kind of telehealth visits that they need, especially in rural areas. And then the last thing is just to help coordinate funding programs. I mentioned the reverse auction. The governor and I are planning to meet with all 13 of those companies over the next couple of months to really understand how we could speed up a lot of their efforts and deployment over the next couple of years. And so I know what they're going to ask. We're going to say no. They're going to ask for money, and we're going to say, well, your guys are getting money. Let's see if there are other things that we could do to be helpful in accelerating their efforts. And then the last is to really coordinate with all this federal pots of money, because again, there are 26 different pots of money. Certain pots of money may make sense in certain areas, may not make sense in other areas, but that's something we're going to do as we continue to work with a lot of our parish leaders. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Can you tell me if the schools and libraries fund is still in force? And if so, can money from that be used to have activity for the students at home?
Yes. So you know what? I'm going to call Representative Desatel, maybe put him on the spot because he was in this business. So maybe you could talk about the role schools can play with regards to broadband.
Thank you. So I think you're referring to the E-rate program. So currently, the USAC, who administers that program, is modifying the rules. So in the past, you could not do any of that. You could not purchase any devices. They couldn't do anything from home. They are modifying the rules to start to allow some of that to happen. So it's really exciting. I think we're going to see some of that happen very shortly, where kids will be able to utilize some of the assets that those schools and libraries currently have, and are getting funded through the E-rate.
Yeah. So look, I'll tell you, based on conversations I've had with the National Governors Association and the folks in DC, every rule for every federal program that applied before the pandemic is effectively being rewritten. Largely because the relevance of some of those programs before the pandemic, given the new reality of where we are, doesn't apply. So as the rep said, everyone's actively going back to the drawing board to modify and tweak federal programs to addressing this.
A second question, what are you doing to help the literacy of those over 65?
So that is a good question because my folks are over 65. You know, I think the same techniques and the same challenges that a 35, 40, 45-year-old, frankly, especially given the National Center of Education statistics that we got, really applies for anyone above 65 as well. I mean, I think the function, and that's why we're talking about in some of these locations, can we start to find digital navigators that serve as your volunteer geek squad? Could that be someone from the church, someone from the police juror, right? Someone from your community college that, you know, can provide sort of office hours to help folks that are above 65, but even folks that are below 65 with basic technical help. We're not talking about coding and programming. We're talking about basic literacy. You know, what happens if my, you know, modem gets cut off? How do I reset it? The printer doesn't work, you know, basic things like that. And so that's part of the conversation on leveraging Dollar General, given where they are.
I'm going to show my ignorance about technology with this question. What about hotspots? Are they not accessible for people to use in areas that are, I got shaking.
No, I can answer that. So I think what we learned through the pandemic was there was this rush to fix a problem without fully understanding the efficacy of that problem. And I think that was a function largely of the behavior of the CARES funding, which had a very quick shot clock that you had to spend that money. So a lot of decisions were made not not in a sort of negative way, but a lot of decisions were made very reactively because they had to solve a problem given the constraints of the funding. In a lot of places, hotspots don't work. It doesn't. I think the frustrations in a lot of areas is it's functional at best, but then if you suddenly have everyone jumping on and accessing bandwidth, then that gets throttled. And which is why, given the amount of federal funding we're getting, our goal is to make something that's more reliable, that's long lasting, which is why fiber and other high speeds are important.
Does this come
Yeah.
down? So poverty seems to be a big concept, and that's understandable. But what is all this engagement doing to address job creation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think I mentioned in one of the slides that for every dollar invested, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's affordability, whether it's literacy, the multiplier is 4 times, right? From a jobs perspective, there's going to be a lot of construction happening, first of all, in a lot of these parishes. So whether you're building and sort of boring fiber underground, installing it pole to pole, there's going to be a surge of construction jobs. Now, that's a good thing. On the flip side, we're anticipating potentially supply chain shortages, not only of this, but also of labor. Because if everyone's going after the same labor at the same time, it's going to present challenges, which is why working with LCTCS and others is going to be critically important to train those and develop those certified skills. Mind you, we're not the only state that's asking the same questions, that's asking these questions and addressing it somewhat, asking and answering it in the same manner. Every state's going to have financial resources to address broadband. So at the federal level, we have bubbled up to folks in the White House to be cognizant of potentially supply chain challenges that may occur, right, in labor and also in hardware and equipment and fiber. But construction is one. The second is, it's understood that the better educated workforce, then the likelihood that they're going to stay in the state. I think part of the frustration, especially that folks that live north of I-10, Alexandria, Northeast Louisiana, West Central, was that historically the population was 50-50, folks that live north of I-10, folks that live out south of I-10. Now that's 1/3, 2/3. So either people are moving south or leaving. And so for a lot of these towns, we need to do whatever we can to retain them. And singularly, in a lot of these places, it's installing connectivity.
So part of my question was aimed, are we going to be bringing a lot of people in for jobs from out of state? Are we going to be developing people?
Yeah. So
The skills in state?
So we have to do a sort of a student body left in building those jobs locally in Louisiana. That's a really good question. I don't know. The impact is, it's in a year from now, we could probably have a better understanding of how many jobs truly will be created based off the amount of investment we're making in broadband. But when it comes to, is it 50,000, 100,000, 150,000? I don't know yet, but I can get back to you. Yes.
Yeah, so I want to applaud your efforts to bring broadband to the rural communities and poverty. But my question is, are any of these efforts or any of these monies being directed at Southwest Louisiana, like
Yeah.
in particular, to try to rebuild the infrastructure that was wiped out by the storm? Because it's been a real impediment to that community's ability to rebuild and come back.
Yeah, so I was actually in Calcasieu last week or 2 weeks ago. If you look at this map, again, a lot of the areas, which is what Calcasieu, Cameron, the Acadiana area, are going to get some of the RDOF money, which is really fiber connectivity and satellite, right? In Southwest Louisiana, in the conversations I've had with the mayor, the police jurors, it is a challenge. And so that's why we're trying to create as many different modalities of technologies, whether it's satellite, whether it's fiber, that we can bring to area. Fortunately, Lake Charles is covered really well. The issues in and around Lake Charles is largely affordability. And that's what the folks in Calcasieu said. There is a big company called Sunblink that sort of stubbed their toe a little bit from a customer service perspective in Southwest Louisiana. And so they're rebuilding in that area. They're investing 150 million, but they fully recognize that they need to improve their customer service as well. And so they're looking at hiring 400 people to addressing that. I've challenged them to hire as many of those people in Louisiana, because if we're talking about remote workforce, broadband, it sort of behooves them to hire as many of those people in Louisiana as possible, wherever they may be in Louisiana. So, thank you.
Meeting adjourned.